And we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is sort of an impromptu live chat. Had a top 10 middleweights of all time countdown scheduled for today with the boxing librarian at Scrapbook Boxing. We had to unfortunately push that back a little bit, maybe a week or so. But I wanted to come and talk a little combat sports, martial arts. So I've got with me here special guest Josh City from 86Boxing. What's up, brother? How you doing?
Hey, all is excuse me, hiccup. All is good. Yeah, happy to be on here and talk some boxing anytime. Like I told you, I'm always willing to jump on here and we can discuss some things because it's a rich history, deep. Glad to be able to chat with you again.
Awesome, man. Yeah, it's great to have you. So I was going to ask you about the gentleman we got on the screen here, but first off, Inoue just won, and I saw at least on one list he now crowns the pound for pound list. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think he's an amazing fighter. He's in his prime right now. I call him Mr. Super Saiyan mode because he went Super Saiyan mode this past Saturday, or no, Tuesday actually, since it was in Japan. But yeah, I was able to catch it. It just so happens I got the notification in enough time. I was able to watch it, and of course, it didn't last too long. 2 rounds, and I suspected that Inoue would get the victory this time around via stoppage. Even though I know that last fight was a very close one, an entertaining fight, and it was a fight of the year, and it lived up to the hype. And one of the reasons I felt this way is because I felt that in a way, he hasn't lost a step or anything of that nature since that last fight. And you could theoretically say he just keeps getting better and better. And not that Donaire had lost a step or two or anything of that nature, but he's gotten older. Of course, Father Time always catches up with everyone. And it's interesting that many years ago, it was Nonito Donaire in this same place, being that young gun that was knocking out everyone explosively and in entertaining fashion. And now, in a way, has taken that mantle as far as those guys down at the lower weights. He's one of them, at least, probably the most high profile as far as pound for pound status right now. And in a way, yeah, he's going to be tough to beat right now at any point in or around 118 pounds. As far as I'm concerned, he's just on his game. He can box, he can punch. I mean, he has speed, power, reflexes, everything you ask for. And you can just tell he's super poised when he's in the ring. And I thought that he showed why he is one of the top fighters pound for pound in the world. I'm sure some people have him up in the 1 through 3 range. I think he's interchangeable anywhere in there, and he's shown it over the last several years, the way he's basically blown out and just ran through top level competition. And you get these rare fighters occasionally that come around, and he just so happens to be one of those rare fighters representing the country of Japan. So shout outs. And it's great to have this type of parity just across the board. And we generally always have had it when you think pound for pound, just, or at least the general notion or thought of it. But definitely a lot of parity there in the pound for pound rankings, having individuals from all over the globe. So Nonito Donaire, if you don't know him, check him out. Explosive fighter. There's plenty of video out there on YouTube. Heck, I may do one myself. It's more on a modern style video, but man, he's worth the price of admission. It would be amazing to see him live and in person. Some of you may have. I had the opportunity potentially once, but hey, when it presents itself again, I might have to jump on it as far as him fighting in the U.S., So, but yeah, in a way, bad dude. Shout out to Rodolfo Rivera as well. He's in the chat room. He said, yo, sup, random, sup, 86. Rodolfo, happy weekend. Y'all just got home. Happy for Inoue. He got his first lineal title. Indeed. Shout out Rodolfo.
Yeah, definitely. I was about to say that. Thanks for stopping by, Rodolfo. It was nice to see you. Sorry the other thing was pushed back, but you know how it is. Grown folks with crazy schedules, these things do happen. It actually gives me at least another week to work on my middleweights list. I made 3 separate lists depending on how I was feeling the day I made it. I'm not happy with any of them. So it's a blessing in disguise for me, at least. But yeah, great to have you here. Yeah, 86, those are good points. Like he improved on his results. That first fight, Inoue Donaire, is probably my favorite. I'm super casual about today's boxing scene, but that's probably my favorite fight of recent years that I saw. Just absolutely compelling, just incredible. And yeah, the rematch didn't go the same way, but Donaire, does he seem to you like a fighter who is gonna, every time he gets in the ring, he's learning something, and he's improving his game, and he'll keep doing that perhaps until his body breaks down. But as far as his learning curve, like his aptitude for learning and adjustment seems to be pretty high.
Well, yes.
So I have up here on this. Oh, sorry, brother. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I certainly agree. Yeah, Donaire. Yeah, he's an amazing fighter. I view him as a Hall of Famer. You might have some who don't, but I think he's a Hall of Famer for sure. Once he finally winds down his career, and who knows, that may be more near, given the status of this previous contest. But man, amazing fighter, Hall of Fame worthy, and it's been a pleasure being able to watch him over the years. And he's always been a great guy as far as just his approachability and his willingness, to just share thoughts and information and just being out there in the sport. So shout outs to Nonito Donaire.
Very cool. So up here on the screen, I have the original Jack Dempsey, non-pareil Jack Dempsey of the late 1800s. Now we're going to take it all the way back real quick. So you've done a video, I understand, on non-pareil Jack Dempsey. You want to just talk about, just for a little bit, about what surprised you about his career, or what you learned when you were looking at someone going this far back, who was, he was a pound for pound type fighter in his day. So what sort of things did you learn about him in researching for your video?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no problem at all. Yes, unrivaled, non-pareil Jack Dempsey. For those that non-pareil, that essentially means unrivaled. And you could argue he was unrivaled during his time. But that being said, yeah, this was a great fighter, an innovative fighter. He fought in the late 1800s. I have to do this I'm doing this off top. I actually did a video on him. Of course, if you search my page, you'll see how good was non-pareil Jack Dempsey, or the original Jack Dempsey, and you'll see just in reviewing his career and everything that he was as good as advertised. At one point, he was arguably the second most popular fighter in the U.S. for sure, but potentially the world, behind John L. Sullivan, since they kind of crossed paths as far as that trajectory up and into the status of being one of those top caliber fighters during the time that they fought. So Dempsey, I want to say he got his career started out in the late 1870s, somewhere around there. But essentially, he fought as a middleweight, but he generally weighed a little bit less than that. As a matter of fact, he wasn't far off from welterweight there. If I recall correctly, there may have been some fights in which he was fighting pretty much right at that welterweight limit. And he essentially fought as a middleweight. And that's where his sort of fame to claim came about in some sense. And during his time, he fought against some of the best competition that was out there. So he not only was a boxer, but he also fought in what would be, I guess, bare knuckle, or if you want to say London prize ring rules or London prize fight rules, which essentially was like bare knuckle in itself as well. There would be times where they would have, skin tight gloves or something of that nature. So just shy of actually the knuckle being bare. But he's actually one of those individuals who he was willing to take on the best challengers of his day, and that allowed for him to be recognized as one of the greatest middleweights in history. But not only that, but just one of the greatest fighters in history. He was actually one of those guys who's very adaptable as far as the sweet science is concerned. Oftentimes we have the notion that the sweet science, or what we consider the scientific side of boxing, started, say, with the likes of Jim Corbett. I hear that a lot. And he was a scientific boxer, no doubt, but he wasn't the first of his kind. He was pretty much one of the first that we saw on video. of course, in the case of Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, there is no video, so we can only go about or view him from the accounts that were out there that were written in newspaper and how it was covered at that particular time. But in doing so, you would see that he was one of these individuals who was very thought provoking. He brought a science to the way that he fought. He wasn't a brawler. He was a pure boxer in that sense, and you can see his stance there, which is common if you're looking at the actual video, the picture that is up. You can see that stance was common from that time. But he is the type who would fight behind a lead jab. He had a combination of just all around skills. He wasn't the most powerful individual. That being said, he had enough power to get the job done at times in which it presented itself. He wasn't the fastest, but he was fast enough to be able to maintain his own against any fighter of his day. He, much like a lot of the fighters during that time, not only fought individuals in or around their weight, but he would also fight individuals who were bigger as well. So that was nothing that was shy of him, or where he wasn't shy of doing such. And he started off his career undefeated in a number of fights. I want to say he was close to that 50 range. He had a few draws, which was common during that time for varying reasons and everything. But that being said, he started out his career on a high trajectory. I have to look up. I'm going to look up his record because he got his first loss. I want to say against La Blanche, but I could be wrong there. But I'm going to actually look it up. But that being said, one of his most high profile losses of his career, of course, was to the great Bob Fitzsimmons, who we're going to discuss as well. And Fitzsimmons, of course, is another great middleweight weight jumper, and it just so happened the two of them crossed paths at that particular time. And I would say that was one of the fights that essentially put Fitzsimmons on the map and making him a household name in some sense, or at least for that particular time. And Fitzsimmons was another one of these guys he fought around that middleweight limit, but he would fight individuals bigger. It didn't matter to him, and he would fight whomever was available at that particular time under whatever circumstances for the most part. But as far as Fitzsimmons by comparison with Dempsey, one of the things that Fitzsimmons did have was that knockout punch. He was one of the pure punchers of his day and of all time. If you just rank it and look back at what he was able to do and even compare it with the fighters of today, Bob Fitzsimmons will forever be recognized as one of the bigger punchers the sport has ever seen, pound for pound. And he's another one of those guys who have a lot of respect and admiration for as far as what he was able to do in the sport of boxing, and him being able to become the first person or the first boxer fighter in general to win a title in 3 weight divisions, that being middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. And even when Fitzsimmons was a heavyweight, he really wasn't a full-fledged heavyweight. He may have been in that between that 160, 170 something range, and I think that was pretty much for the totality of his career. But he was able to defeat men who were larger because of the fact that not only he could box, but he also had that eraser that few often have, in the sport, when they say that you can't teach a puncher or you can't teach a knockout artist type situation. You can only, train them, teach them, of course, the fundamentals and all that stuff. But some people are just born as punchers, and Bob Fitzsimmons is one of those individuals. I did a video on him as well, and he actually got his start. He was actually in a tournament that was orchestrated by the great bare knuckle fighter Jim Mace. Jim Mace did have some uh, regular Marcus of Queensberry fights, but he primarily fought and made his name as a bare knuckle fighter. But Fitzsimmons actually participated in a tournament. The tournament took place in Australia, if I recall correctly, and at that particular time, Fitzsimmons, he was living, I believe, in New Zealand, which is interesting, right? I think a lot of people don't know that. We know him as a UK fighter, but yeah, he spent some time in New Zealand. So he essentially participated in these tournaments that Jim Mace had. It was on two occasions he won the tournament. So Mace had put on multiple, but it was two occasions in which Fitzsimmons won, and that's when he, started to get some notice, just from an overall standpoint, before deciding to make that trip over to the great old US of A in order to continue to pursue a fight career and take on the best that were available at that particular time. And of course, that is the path that a lot of individuals generally took at that particular time, and it's still the case, I guess you can say, today. In some sense, there's a big contingent of fans here in America, but we see that the UK, they have a great deal of fans. I mean, some of the best fans, arguably the best, just the way that they really turn out for their fighters. Then you have some others, Mexico, similar situation. Look at the backing that Canelo has. But Fitzsimmons, essentially, he migrated here to the U.S., where he wanted to continue to pursue fights and essentially take on the best and make a name for himself. And boy, did he, in the sense that, of course, he's one of the Hall of Famers, one of the great Hall of Famers, one of the pound-for-pound best fighters ever. All this in a career in which, by some of the standards of the time, I want to say Fitzsimmons might have had around 70-ish fights or something like that, which is average for the time. A similar situation with non-paral Jack Dempsey as far as what's recorded, at least. But it was one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, brother. I was just gonna say, yeah, they have. It's hard to know. Sometimes some of these fighters in this time had fights that, for legal reasons, they're not putting in the newspaper because, like, this is later in Fitz's career. But I saw an article at the end of 1902 that said 24 states had boxing as legal. But at that time, fighting was very popular. People were fighting in every state. They just weren't fighting on the books. That's something important to realize. So a lot of fights, guys like Jack Blackburn, Joe Gans, Georgie Dixon, probably Fitz too, although he was making good money. So I'm not sure about him specifically, but a lot of guys were fighting, especially on their way up. They were just fighting whenever they could. Tough matchup is almost better because you get a name on your ledger. So you become notable by fighting notable people. You can build an empty record, a padded record, and that happened all the time. Sometimes people just build it real quick over 2 years, 20, 25 wins with very little setbacks. But then you have to match up to be more than just a name in the newspaper, in the listing. You have to be someone who fought someone, so they can literally, because that's literally how you're being described. So like Sam Langford, the guy I'm studying the most, he was Sam Langford until he beat Joe Gans. And then he was Sam Langford, who beat Joe Gans over 15 rounds. That stayed with him. And then as he accumulated all of these notable opponents, then he built his own myth. Basically, when you get to the point where you've had too many notable opponents to put in a simple listing or a simple blurb, now you are one of those people. People built their name off of fighting Langford too. So that's how some of his less experienced opponents, it was a chance for them and a payday. At this time, there were a lot of fights out there. But if you have guys like Langford and Walcott and Gans who are able to fight 10, 15, 20 times a year, Dave Holly, a lot of guys. So all those slots are taken by notable people who are putting in 10 or 15 fights a year. So if you're coming up, you take whatever you can get. And sometimes having a tough fight, even if you get your ass kicked, is better than not fighting anyone notable. You need to attach yourself to something important. And I don't know if it's quite like that today, because prospect building is so finely refined and the media machine is more evolved now. But in this day, to get beyond just being a name in the paper, a simple name, you had to do something special. Lots of people were doing pretty cool stuff, but you had to really excel. And sometimes you would, and there would still be questions like Langford was still described as a prospect after he'd beaten Joe Gans, who was one of the greatest fighters of his whole generation.
Mm-hmm.
He was because it's what class you're in, class as far as talent, but also class as in weight class. The heavyweight, especially in this time, the heavyweight weight class was the weight class. Everything else was a way for the smaller guys to compete. So sometimes the smaller guys could, like Stanley Catchell, you know, Langford when he fought Johnson for the colored heavyweight title. You know, if you're smaller, you still want that heavyweight shot. Joe Walcott, Barbados Walcott, calling out all the heavyweights, posting a forfeit, $1,000 forfeit, wanting to meet any man in the world. Like that's.
Oh yeah.
So it's a little different today, but so part of the reason Fitz became such a huge star is because not just because he was clocking people super hard and he was really talented and he was associated with talented lineage of boxing, but he moved up to heavyweight and did it. The actual weight class, like at least at that time, you know, that's the real weight, like open weight, like who's the better man, not with any kind of things. And I think part of the argument against putting on gloves or round limits and things was like because it's a small, even if it's safer, it's a smaller opportunity to prove ultimately who is the best. Like Jeanette and McVeigh when they went 49 rounds in Paris in 1909, they fought 3 times, but that finish fight, that's, you know, you're really putting it on to see who's the best. So, but I just wanted to shout out. Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and thanks for the great information on Fitz. He's a fascinating character. Those 3 weight classes were full weight classes. You know, he wasn't playing around. There were guys who did more of a gradual climb, like today's, like Tommy Ryan was hugely successful. Another guy who probably would have been
spamming the chat as well with some races.
Okay, hold on. Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, that's pretty weird. Okay, hold on a second. So if I block that guy, that means that no one will see what he's saying?
Yeah, I believe that is the case. So we can do it. It's posting a bunch of...
I hit block, but take a look on yours if you can and make sure that it's not visible to anyone else.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, yeah, I blocked him as well. But yeah, you can't see it. It went away once it was blocked.
Okay, yeah, good. So let's get back to talking about, because there were a lot of racial politics in this time, and not everyone fought across racial lines, or at least for championships. Oh, thanks, Rodolfo. Yeah, we get that out of there. This is for grown folks, this conversation. Yeah. You know, the trolls, they're much more fun places to do that than here. We're just talking history. We're giving respect, even to fighters that didn't always cross racial lines. They're still fighting top fighters. Like Tommy Ryan doesn't have he did fight some guys. I mean, he fought Frank Craig and Denver Martin, but he didn't have like a long list of black opponents. And but he still fought some really tough guys, a lot of really tough guys. So it's not like we have to trash, you know, all the other guy, Kid McCoy or Dick O'Brien or any of these other guys who are also, they're fighting a schedule. It's just that the ideal is to have people fight everybody. Fitzsimmons was big on that. He was like, you got to fight everybody. You want to be the best. And this was in the 1800s, he was saying that. So the idea that everybody thought a certain one kind of way about fighters, white and black fighters fighting each other, no, that depended on the region. And also, it depended on the region and then the specific place in general and what time, when it was happening. Because there were some pivotal events like where boxing would become banned in a place where previously it wasn't, or they would put a clamp down and limit the rounds and make it a no decision area. That happened in Boston during Langford's rise. Like a young man died in the ring or shortly after being in the ring, and Police Commissioner Emmons started to crack down on the athletic clubs, and including the club that Langford was fighting out of. His backer ran the club.
Not to interrupt you, it seems like we got another one. You need to block them. Probably it is the same person. They have multiple accounts, but you can just block them. But shout out to Bruce Gas, boxing and jazz and more. Shout out Bruce.
Yeah, what's up, Bruce?
He decided to drop in. If you haven't checked out Bruce, be sure to go check him out. It's very entertaining. Very entertaining. Talk about boxing and more.
Yeah, so I think, there's some people who troll. That's their fun, but, it's kind of empty. I kind of feel bad because, anyone who has any kind of happiness in their life, they're not they want other people to be happy. And so I just hope whoever that is, I hope you have a better day, and have some self-respect. It's pretty easy to be annoying, but it's not impressive. It's
Yeah.
impressive to actually keep your cool when people are trying to be annoying, but have a good day anyway, cheer up. Nobody's threatening your manhood, talking about people should fight each other in combat sports. It's not about us, it's not about you, it's just about these athletes.
Yep.
Think of this as
And
a
at the end of
library.
the day,
You could,
that
if you
person
want
took
to
the time to
masturbate,
come
you got
check
to
you
leave
out.
the library. Sorry, what's that?
At the end of the day, they took the time to come check you out, so they respect your opinion.
Yeah, or just want to have some impact. But really, that's not what this is about. This isn't about me or my ego or anything to do with me at all. We're just discussing the greats. I appreciate you, Josh. You have the right attitude for this sort of thing, because it does take a little bit of maturity to handle the fact that there was a lot of racial discussion in this
Oh yeah.
time, and that there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of sort of masculinity at stake in boxing in general. That's why someone would post money with the newspaper man. They were much more respected in that day. In fact, they were involved in the booking.
Mm-hmm.
They would hold the forfeits. They would sometimes even hold the purses in escrow. Like, it was respected. Being a boxing writer wasn't easy to get that position. So, but like, there was a lot of racism. Sometimes even while giving people their sporting respect, they were still being derogatory in a racist sense, or trying to explain away the difference in skill. If the black fighter happened to be better, that, like, it's unfair. Like, oh well, yeah, but they're like a caveman or this or that. There's a lot of fragility, but we can just discuss it in a mature way, because really it's just a sport. So even when a sport is kind of messed up, it's still a sport, and it's martial arts. So we can respect it, even if sometimes the athletes didn't hold to an ideal that we would prefer. Thanks everyone for listening and checking it out. This is definitely more of a grown-ups type channel. I'm not really, unless you want to hear me talk about the Bellator MMA League, then I'm a goofy little kid. But this is history right here. This is all long said and done. We just want to give everybody their respect. And we're
Yeah.
talking about weight jumpers. So Tommy Ryan was the welterweight champion. Then he moved up and he actually became the middleweight champion, and had only lost twice out of all those fights, over 100 fights, I believe. So pretty incredible stuff, but more of a gradual climb. Whereas some people make okay, so like, take the great Mickey Walker. He was a rock and roll character because he was jumping up in weight before he was big enough to be in the weight. The toy bulldog, he could go, and I guess with it, he had a lot of power, but his stopping power isn't always reflected in how many knockouts he had, because he's fighting above
Mm-hmm.
his weight. He's not always matched with a guy with the same sized head and chin. You know what I mean? Like, even though he had quite a spectacular chin, you could see it, but literally and figuratively. But Walker was jumping up. So if he's fighting someone like Sharkey or Schmeling, like, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily think he was going to get a knockout. That's, I guess, another reason why Langford's so special, because he was the little guy who could get the knockouts up in the higher weights.
Yeah.
Partly because he fought such a schedule, he had seen it all. Like, I saw on Facebook, someone was trying to start a discussion, being a bit mocking, like, oh, there are people who think Langford could ever beat Fury. I was like, well, Fury's an awfully big guy, and he's smooth for a big guy, but he's not Joe Gans smooth. He's not Joe Walcott tricky. He's tricky for today, but he's not. Langford had seen it all by the time he got to heavyweight. That's how he stayed 15 rounds with Jack Johnson, giving up like 30 pounds to one of the greats.
Mm-hmm.
Johnson, another pound for pound fighter of his day. You know what I mean? People say the heavyweights can't be the pound for pounders. Well, Joe Louis, Jack Johnson, Fitz, these guys were considered the best man for their weight, as well as the best guy in open weight waters. There's no conflict there. Who's the best for their size is a pretty easy equation. But Walker's certainly one of them, and he had a huge career. Welterweight and then middleweight champion. And we were talking about being matched tough. Well, he learned from his loss to Greb. When he moved up, he was the welterweight champion, moved up to challenge the great Harry Greb. Had a great fight, but Greb got the best of him, but people improved from those losses. 2 weeks later, Maxie Rosenblum, another great fighter with an incredible resume, he fought Greb, and he was, I think he was still a teenager, like 19, 20 years old, and he learned from that and changed his whole fight style. He had a revelation the way Greb fought him, as far as like the combinations and elusiveness and in and out movement and everything. So Rosenblum went from being sort of a hard-nosed fighter. I think he'd had maybe 40 fights by then, but that's not a huge amount for some of these schedules. Rosenblum ended up having, about 300, was it?
Yeah, somewhere in that range. Yeah, it was crazy, astronomical amount.
Right. And Langford probably had almost 100 by the time he actually hit his actual full fight prime, his peak. that lasted for years. But you know, these guys, it wasn't unusual. So Rosenblum at 40 fights hadn't necessarily seen all of the best competition at that time. So Greb was like a revelation for him. So people learn from losses. I liked seeing Joshua take a different approach in the second fight with Ruiz.
Oh yeah,
It
yeah,
was night
yeah,
and day, you know. He
yeah.
only fell into the
That's a
bad
good
habit a
example.
couple times.
Yeah, that's a good example. Definitely, I think that's what it's about as well in terms of fighting, and it kind of alludes to what you're pointing out with how these guys started out, especially back in the day. Losses didn't mean anything to that degree, as far as we get a lot of individuals today or fighters today who want to protect their zero in some sense, as it's a piece of marketing just as much as a fight in itself, regardless of the fact that they could have built up this record without fighting any legitimate competition as far as the sport's concerned. But what one of the things that I liked about back in the day was the fact that these guys, they were fighting and they were taking on tough opponents from the start. So you didn't get the luxury of building up your record. So of course you're going to take some losses, you're going to take some L's and everything, but it's about how you learn from them and how you build from that. And where that compares to today, of course, if you're taking on the best, then you're generally going to learn from that, to learn from those fights today as well. You look at a guy like Sean Porter, he's a good example from a modern standpoint of someone who at welterweight who has fought pretty much all of the best welterweights that are out there right now, the guys that we want to see fight, that being Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, which is going to happen. But Porter, he's fought them, and I'm sure he's learned from each of those fights. And he was one of those individuals who, yes, while he had some losses in some close fights, it was to top level competition, and he continued to build himself and garner more and more fans from that standpoint. Because at the end of the day, when you're in the ring and it's the two of you fighting, we don't see the records. We see two men or women mano a mano right there, and whatever happens is whatever happens as far as what the outcome of the fight is. There are cases where you can be considered the better fighter, you can have the trumped up record, and you can end up being the one who is walking out of there with a loss. So that's the thing that I admired by these about these guys from back in the day. They didn't care about that, and even from a fan standpoint, it wasn't as big by comparison today, where you even have some fans who are clamoring for and pushing towards fighters protecting these very same records and everything. But that's why you'll occasionally get a fighter who has a number of losses on his record. They get an opportunity to take on one of these guys, these young guys who was undefeated, being viewed as the next big thing, and they'll end up shocking to a certain group. It'll be a shock at least. They'll end up shocking the crowd with the win, and that's because hey, in between those losses, there were some learning curves, some things that they overcame, some things that probably tested them to a degree that this young fighter who is undefeated hasn't seen and probably hadn't seen until that point. And these guys end up, continuing to make their mark. They seize their opportunities when they get them, and that's very much what it was like back in the day. You have to seize the opportunity when you get it, because at that particular time, of course, as we know, the title shot wasn't guaranteed with one belt being available, and with that one belt, you had the majority of the guys who were gunning for it. These were all top tier fighters who some never even got a shot, and they they were probably deserving. And if you compare that with some of these fighters today with the Afro belt titles and everything, there's really not a comparison, because some of these individuals have gotten their belts through other means, or whether that's they're just being awarded because some champion was pushed up to become some super champion or something of that nature. But just at the end of the day, these guys had a tougher road getting to those titles. I mean, that's not to say that some of the individuals from today don't, but there are definitely levels to careers and how you start. You think about some of the heavyweights from that time, especially in just the way they started out. And I think of Bob Armstrong, for instance. I believe his first fight was against Joe Chowinski, who was one of the best fighters from that time. Another fighter who didn't get a world title. He may have had a claim out there, but he never won a world title. But he was also someone who was in with Jack Johnson early in his career, knocked him out. Just goes to show you there are definitely levels to this competition thing. And I think that's what's been the beauty of these guys from the past being able to just stand the test of time. You can look back on their records, look at who they fought, especially at early points in their careers, and you can just marvel at the fact that these guys were like real life superheroes in that sense.
They really were. Yeah, they really were. Like Joe Walcott right here, Barbados Walcott. Brilliant fighter, crouching fighter, short guy with a huge upper body. He, like the title fight he got at lightweight, he had to stop Kid Levine or he lost. Right? Isn't that pretty much the setup for the contract? So they fought 15 rounds, and if he didn't get a finish, regardless of how he did, he lost the fight. But he tried for his opportunity. He later won the welterweight world title and scared so many of the guys his own size that he would fight middleweights. But he was fighting middleweight. I think he fought Dick O'Brien within a couple years of starting fighting. So he was still a lightweight, fighting larger guys. Dick O'Brien, I'm pretty sure, competed for the middleweight title. I don't know if he won it, but he competed for it, I'm pretty sure. But might have been against Tommy Ryan, actually, now that I think about it. I'd have to go look. I don't have my notes. I'm about to go into work. But Joe Walcott took opportunity, and he had a powerful manager, Tom O'Rourke, who ran multiple clubs in different states, and but he had to overcome adversity, and he had to take what he could get. He wasn't plugged in. And although at the lower weights, having a black champion wasn't as taboo as as the establishment heavyweight title, which was held in such high prestige.
Indeed.
I mean, heavyweights were so important. So when they list all the different champions at the end of the year in the newspaper early in the 1900s, they list the champion, the heavyweight champion, and the colored heavyweight champion, then all the other titles, whoever holds them, white or black. They might mention if they're colored or not, but they don't. So that heavyweight being the best of the big guys was huge. And, partly why Johnson, when he won the world title from Tommy Burns, he was out to make some money because he had done an enormous amount as colored champion before that coming up just to get there. So it was time to cash in, just like other people have done. Fitz wasn't as busy once he was the guy, because then he could demand athletic clubs raise the purses offered. He was big on that, or he would do exhibitions for big money. All right, I'll do 3 rounds with 3 different guys tonight. I saw an article of that in Chicago. He was going to let 3 guys come in, and one of them begged out of the contest, saying it wouldn't be good for his image or his health. I was like, wow. So Fitz has a deceptive record. He did a lot more for the sport of boxing than simply what's in his professional record, official decisions.
Oh yeah.
Some guys are like that. Bob Armstrong, you mentioned, he was a fantastic trainer. He was one of the best trainers of his era after he had already been the colored heavyweight champ.
Yeah, he had a tough road as far as his tough sledding there at heavyweight. So he ran into a lot of stiff competition that he had to just face early on. It's a lot like with the guys who came about there a little bit later on as well, as far as a lot of the same guys having to fight each other over and over. But yeah, that's tough. He had no breaks. His first fight out of the gates, as mentioned, was stiff, and it only got worse there from a relative standpoint, at least, as far as that competition just continued to rise as he went on. So if you look at his record, it doesn't look like anything that you write home about, but once you dig in between the lines, you'll see that, he was in there with some stiff competition, and that always makes for building the fighter. So he probably learned more from that allowed for him to transition as a trainer. And you saw that with a lot of guys from back in that day, or you see that even in this day with guys who you wouldn't necessarily consider them to have been great fighters if you just look at their record at face value. some journeymen, but they're able to teach the sport in a way that it affects the lives of other young fighters as they're coming up. And that's because they learn a lot just going through those trials and tribulations. I mean, you can't, you everyone doesn't get an opportunity to fight a Sam Langford multiple times, say the likes of a Jeanette, Harry Wills, and vice versa, Sam McVeigh, etc. Like, you don't often get the chance to fight these guys multiple times, especially these days. It's a situation where, yeah, if you get in there with one of those pound for pound fighters and you don't win, especially depending on the degree of which you lose, yeah, that might be your last opportunity to get in there with one of those pound for pound best fighters. So, you just gotta have to take that for what it is. And oftentimes, yeah, back then, these were pound for pound, top level great fighters that were facing each other multiple times. So you can't help but learn from that. You continue to push forward, and that's why when you look at how they fared with other competition, they did very well. Because, of course, if you consider Langford to be the best heavyweight at that time and you're fighting him multiple times, yeah, you take some losses, probably many losses, before you're able to get you a win or whatever in. But that's through learning, through repetition, and it's just like anything. So if you run into some individuals who haven't yet been able to reach that level of competition as far as who they face, then, yeah, it's going to be probably easier faring for you as you go through that process. So, yeah, that's another thing to take into account with those guys from back then. And Langford is a prime example of that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. That's very true. And like with Langford, by the end of, like, he had one pro fight in 2002, but in 1903, he went out there 27 times. So, but that wasn't just all random people. He fought a guy who had won the amateurs at the weight class above him the year before. He fought Stonewall Allen. He fought Patsy Sweeney. Patsy Sweeney had been a high-level factor a few years before. He was still a capable fighter, and he got rid of him late in the fight, overcame adversity against a really tough fella who had tons more experience in years and fights than him. And then, but then he fought Joe Gans. He did so much. He got a shot against Joe Gans at the end of his first full season and beat him. And but then he had a draw. Then he had a draw where Jack Blackburn, who later coached Joe Louis for the uninitiated, where he got a draw, but he got beaten up, and he had already lost Blackburn got the best of him in more rounds, I should say, even though it was a prearranged draw, so the money would be even regardless of the outcome. And there was a thing there that people wanted things to go to a decision. It's easier to bet on that, but it didn't always work, and sometimes with politics or jurisdiction, you just didn't get it. But Langford had already faced like a lot of variety of styles and quality, and the next year it would even escalate. You say, well, how do you escalate from fighting one of the greatest lightweights of all time in Joe Gans in his prime? Well, you fight Barbados Walcott, one of the greatest welterweights of all time in his prime. And you fight him the next year, and then have a bunch of fights against Dave Holly. He lost one of the ones against Dave Holly. Holly could use like the shoulder roll, and he was very tricky. Crouching at times, like he could switch it up though. Holly had huge experience. He'd only been fighting since 1900 himself, but I think he probably had more than 80 fights when they met already just a few years later. Holly got the best of him, but Langford learns. He improved on his results. And that's like to circle back to Inoue before, because I actually have to go in. We're about to call it, but people who couldn't, that experience counts, because you never know the peaks you'll get to. Guys lose and go on to do great things. Think of how many years people were writing off Bernard Hopkins. Yeah. Like, he's done. They were saying he was done years before he lost Calzaghe, and he still wasn't done. And they were saying it for years. Different guys can be adaptable to their own circumstances. So Greb, Langford, a lot of these fighters that fight this tremendous schedule, they take a lot of wear and tear, and they have to change, or their results suffer. And so Foreman did it. And if Inoue went from that fantastic competitive, my favorite fight of recent years, to blowing out the guy, that's serious. That shows improvement. He learned a lot. And those thinking fighters tend to escape with less severe damage, especially if they're not going to try and have hundreds of fights like these guys. That's a different thing. Hey,
without a doubt.
But I got to go clock in. I want to thank you for coming on, Josh City. People, go subscribe to 86 Boxing. Let's do this again soon. This was so much fun.
Yeah, without a doubt. I'm gonna get you on the podcast as well. Shout out to everyone who joined in, Rodolfo, Bruce, etc. But yeah,
Yeah,
have a
and
good
I'm
one.
I'm not sure who's down there. I can't look. I gotta go, but yeah, shout out to Scrapbook and Hardline and Dolfo and Andre and all the guys who come by, all the regulars. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.